Hello there, and welcome back to the Sleepy Historian. Find a comfortable place. Let the sounds of your day fade away, and allow the quiet of the night to settle around you. We are here to drift through the past, not as a series of dates and battles, but as a collection of quiet, human moments. Did you know that the gleaming armor of a Roman legionary, a symbol of unshakable power, might have been a mask, hiding a world of silent suffering and profound sorrow? Tonight, we are not looking at the legion as a war machine, but at the man inside the iron. We are going to listen for the heartbeat beneath the breastplate. If you enjoy these quiet explorations into the past, please consider subscribing. It helps our small channel find others who appreciate a slower story. Now, close your eyes if you wish, and let us travel back to the world of the Roman soldier. The image is iconic. A man encased in polished iron and leather, the larica segmentata gleaming under a foreign sun. His helmet, with its proud crest, obscures his face, making him an anonymous instrument of the Senate and people of Rome. He is a symbol of order, of civilization's sharp edge against the chaos of the world. This is the soldier we see on victory columns and in grand mosaics, a figure of strength, discipline, and unwavering loyalty. But this armor, this uniform, was more than just protection. It was a cage. It was a second skin that he could never truly shed, one that held him apart from the world he was supposedly protecting. It was heavy, not just with the weight of metal, but with the weight of expectation, the weight of the eagle standard he marched beneath, and the weight of all the things he was forced to leave behind. Beneath that polished, impersonal exterior was a man who felt fear, loneliness, and a deep, gnawing sadness that the rigid discipline of the legions was designed to suppress, but could never truly extinguish. The armor hid the scars on his body, but it also served to conceal the deeper wounds on his soul, the sorrows that had no voice in the annals of history. The journey into this life of sorrow often began not with a bang, but with a whimper. We imagine eager young men, fired by tales of glory, rushing to enlist, and for some, the sons of established families seeking a path to political power, this was true. But for the vast majority of recruits during the long centuries of the empire, the choice was not made in pursuit of glory, but in flight from despair. Imagine a young man in a dusty provincial village, the son of a tenant farmer whose crops have failed for the third year in a row. His family is starving. He has no trade, no land of his own, no prospects. Then a recruiting officer arrives in the market square, his armor a dazzling promise of a different life. He speaks of regular pay, an enlistment bonus, and the ultimate prize after 25 years of service, a plot of land and a pension that could support a family for a lifetime. For the boy who has known only hunger and uncertainty, this is not a choice. It is the only way out. He enlists not for Rome, but for a piece of bread. He signs away the next quarter century of his life to escape the crushing weight of poverty. And so, his first sorrow is sown, the sorrow of a life path chosen by desperation, a future mortgaged for survival. He leaves behind his home, his language, his family, everything he has ever known, to become a number in a century, his personal history erased to better serve the empire's future. The transformation from a desperate farm boy into a Roman legionary was a brutal and systematic process. The Romans called it disciplina, and it was the bedrock of their military supremacy. But it was a process of breaking a man down to his very foundations and rebuilding him as a cog in a machine. The training was relentless, a daily grind of marching, running, swimming, and weapons practice that pushed the body to its absolute limit. Recruits would march 20 miles in 5 hours, then do it again in heavier armor, all while carrying their own supplies, tools, and stakes for building a camp. The training weapons were twice the weight of the real ones, ensuring that the gladius and pilum would feel like feathers in the heat of battle. But the physical hardship was only part of it. The true goal was to strip away the recruit's individuality, He was taught to obey any order instantly, without question or hesitation. He learned to move as one part of a larger whole, his own survival secondary to the integrity of the shield wall. Centurions, often hardened veterans who had risen from the ranks, used the vitis, a vine staff, to enforce this discipline with casual brutality. A moment's hesitation, a sloppy drill, a flicker of defiance, would be met with a swift, painful blow. This was not just punishment, it was psychological conditioning. It taught the recruit that his own feelings, his fear, his pain, his exhaustion, were irrelevant. All that mattered was the legion. The sorrow here was the loss of self, the quiet death of the person he used to be, replaced by a hardened, obedient soldier who was taught that his own humanity was a weakness to be beaten out of him. The life of a legionary was a life spent on the move. Even when not on a specific campaign, legions were often transferred from one end of the empire to another, a journey that could take months or even years. The march was the soldier's constant reality, a grueling, monotonous rhythm that defined his existence. Imagine him, part of a long column of men, snaking through an unfamiliar landscape, a Gallic forest dense with mist. The scorching heat of a Syrian desert, or the biting wind of the German frontier, he carried an immense weight. His armor, his weapons, his shield, his helmet, plus a pack known as the sarcina, which contained his rations for several days, a cooking pot, a shovel, a saw, and 2 heavy wooden stakes for the camp's palisade. The total weight could exceed 80 pounds. He marched day after day, his shoulders aching, his feet blistered and raw inside his hobnailed sandals, the caligae. The world became a blur of the back of the man in front of him and the endless, unforgiving road. There was no room for deep thought, only for the next step, and the one after that. The sorrow of the march was a slow, grinding one. It was the sorrow of utter exhaustion, a weariness that seeped into the bones. It was the sorrow of monotony, of seeing the world not as a place of wonder, but as a series of obstacles to be overcome. It was a physical manifestation of his life, a long, hard road to a destination he might never reach, with no chance of turning back. At the end of every grueling day's march came not rest, but more labor. A Roman army on the move never simply slept under the stars. It built a fortified camp every single night. This was a marvel of engineering and discipline. A temporary fortress that could be erected in a matter of hours. But for the individual soldier, it was just another layer of exhaustion. After marching 20 miles under a crushing load, he had to dig. He would dig a deep ditch around the perimeter of the camp, use the earth to build a rampart, and then drive his 2 heavy stakes into the top to create a palisade. This was back-breaking work, performed with the same relentless efficiency as every other task. There was no rest until the camp was secure. This constant labor was a key part of Roman military strategy. It kept the men occupied and fit, and it ensured their safety in hostile territory. But it also contributed to the soldier's silent suffering. It denied him even a moment's peace to process the day, to reflect, or to simply rest his aching body. His life was an endless cycle of marching and digging, a Sisyphean task where the fortress he built today would be abandoned tomorrow, only to be built again and again. The sorrow was in the futility of it, the knowledge that his immense effort was temporary, erased by the morning's light, just like his own footprints on the long road of empire, once inside the walls of the camp or a permanent fort. The soldier found not privacy, but the opposite. He was crammed into a barrack block with the other 7 men of his contubernium, his tent group. This small room was his entire world. Here they ate, slept, and maintained their gear. There was no personal space, no moment of quiet solitude. The smells of sweat, leather, and unwashed bodies were ever present. The sounds of snoring, coughing, and quiet arguments were the nightly chorus. This forced intimacy bred a powerful camaraderie. These men became his brothers, the only family he had on the frontier. They relied on each other for survival, and this bond was a powerful antidote to despair. But it also meant he could never truly be alone. He could never show weakness, a moment of grief for a lost family member back home, a flicker of fear about an upcoming battle. These were emotions that had to be ruthlessly suppressed. To cry was to risk being seen as weak, a liability to the group. And so the soldier learned to wear another piece of armor, an internal one. He built a wall around his own heart, presenting a stoic, unreadable face to the men he lived with. His deepest sorrows were his own, to be dealt with in the dead of night, in the silent moments when he stared at the wooden ceiling, surrounded by sleeping men, feeling utterly and completely alone in a crowded room. The discipline that forged the Roman army was maintained by a constant and pervasive threat of violence, while the centurion's vine staff was a daily reality. There were far worse punishments lurking in the shadows of military law. For individual infractions like falling asleep on guard duty, the penalty was often death. The condemned soldier would be brought before the assembled legion, and his own comrades, the men from his contubernium, would be forced to stone or club him to death. This was the fustuarium, a brutal ritual designed to instill terror and enforce collective responsibility. Imagine the psychological toll, not just on the condemned, but on those forced to be his executioners, to kill a man you had shared meals with, marched with, fought beside, all for a moment of human weakness. It was a sorrow mixed with horror, a deep trauma that would linger long after the act was done. For larger groups, if a century or cohort was deemed to have shown cowardice, it could be subject to decimation. The men would draw lots, and 1 in every 10 would be executed by his own comrades. This was the ultimate expression of the Roman military ethos. The individual was nothing. The legion was everything. The soldier lived under a permanent shadow of fear, not just of the enemy, but of his own commanders and the unforgiving system he served. His life was not his own, and it could be extinguished at any moment for the smallest mistake. The Roman Empire may have seemed vast and interconnected from the perspective of Rome, but for the soldier stationed on its fringes, it was the edge of the known world. For decades, a man might be stationed in one place, along Hadrian's Wall in the cold, damp mists of Britannia, or on the banks of the Rhine, staring into the dark, foreboding forests of Germania, or in the deserts of the east, watching the distant dust clouds that might signal a Parthian raid. Here, the loneliness was profound. He was an alien in a hostile land, surrounded by people whose language he did not speak and whose customs he did not understand. The world outside the fort's walls was a place of constant, low-level dread. Every shadow in the trees, every strange noise in the night, could be a threat. This life bred a deep sense of isolation and paranoia. He was separated from the entire civilized world as he knew it. News from home was months or even years old, if it came at all. The sorrow of the frontier was the sorrow of exile. He was a guardian of an empire he could no longer truly see, defending a concept of Rome that grew more distant and dreamlike with each passing year. He was trapped between 2 worlds, no longer belonging to the home he'd left behind, and never truly a part of the land he now occupied. His only reality was the fort, a tiny island of Roman order in a vast sea of perceived chaos. All the training, the marching, and the discipline led to one singular purpose: battle, and in the hours before a fight, a profound and heavy silence would fall over the camp. This was when the soldier's deepest fears would surface. He would sit by the fire, methodically sharpening his gladius, checking the straps on his armor, performing the small rituals that gave him a sense of control in a situation where he had none. He would think of home, of a face he hadn't seen in years, of the small plot of land he hoped to own one day. He would pray to his gods, to Mars for courage, or perhaps to a small, local deity he had adopted for protection. This was a unique kind of sorrow. The sorrow of anticipation. It was the cold dread of knowing that in a few hours He would be facing a screaming enemy, that he might kill or be killed, that he might suffer a terrible wound and die slowly in the mud. He would look at the faces of his comrades around the fire, men he had known for years, and wonder which of them he would be burying by sunset. There was no glory in this moment, no patriotic fervor. Only the quiet, personal terror of a man facing his own mortality. The armor was on, but it offered no protection from the war that raged within his own mind. Then came the battle itself. The Roman legion was a terrifyingly effective killing machine, but for the man in the ranks, it was a sensory nightmare. The air would be thick with the sounds of war, the blare of trumpets, the shouted commands of the centurions, the war cries of the enemy, and then the screams of the wounded and the dying from both sides. It was a cacophony of human suffering. He would stand in the shield wall, shoulder to shoulder with his comrades. The press of bodies so tight he could barely move. He would see the enemy's faces, contorted with rage or terror, just feet away. He would feel the jarring impact of blows on his shield, the spray of blood, the sickening thud of his gladius striking flesh and bone. The smell was overwhelming, sweat, blood, mud, and death. In the chaos of melee, his training would take over. He would jab and thrust. A simple, repetitive motion designed for maximum efficiency in close quarters. He was no longer an individual, but a component of the machine. A single, bloody cog. But the man inside was still there, witnessing and participating in acts of extreme violence. This was the deepest trauma, the source of a sorrow so profound it had no name. Today, we might call it post-traumatic stress disorder. For the Roman soldier, it was simply a part of his reality, a host of terrible memories that would replay in his mind for the rest of his life. A wound that no physician could ever heal. When the fighting stopped and the enemy was broken, a different kind of horror began. The soldier would stand in the aftermath, leaning on his shield, his body trembling with adrenaline. The field was a charnel house, littered with the dead and dying. He would have to find his own fallen comrades, men he had shared a joke with that morning, now lying still and silent. He would see the horrific injuries that a gladius or a pilum could inflict. This was the moment when the stoic mask often cracked. The sight of a dead friend, the sheer scale of the carnage, could overwhelm even the most hardened veteran. There was the sorrow of loss, a grief that was sharp and immediate. But there was also the more complex sorrow of the survivor. Why did he live when his friend died? This guilt could be a heavy burden, a ghost that would walk with him forever. He had done his duty. He had survived. But the cost was etched into his memory. He had looked into the abyss of human violence, and a part of him would remain there forever. The silence after the battle was often more deafening than the noise, filled with the unspoken grief of the men who were left to clean up the dead. The sorrow of the Roman soldier was not limited to the personal dangers he faced. He was also an agent of conquest, and he was often a participant in acts of great cruelty. After a city was taken or a tribe was subdued, the legionaries were sometimes let loose to sack the settlement. They would witness or take part in the slaughter of civilians, the enslavement of women and children, the burning of homes. Roman commanders used this as a tool of terror to break the will of their enemies, but for the individual soldier, it could create a deep moral injury. He might be a farm boy from Spain, forced to cut down another farm boy from Gaul who was only defending his own home. He might be ordered to enslave a family that looked much like his own. This was the weight of the eagle, the psychological burden of being the instrument of a brutal imperial policy. While some soldiers may have become desensitized or even reveled in the violence, many others must have been haunted by what they had been forced to do. This sorrow was a quiet, shameful thing, a stain on the soul that could not be washed away. He was building an empire, but he was also destroying worlds, and he had to live with the knowledge of his role in that destruction. A silent conflict between his duty as a soldier and his conscience as a man. In the quiet moments of camp life, a soldier's thoughts would inevitably drift homeward. His only connection to that lost world was through letters. Written on thin wooden tablets coated with wax, these messages were a lifeline, but it was a tenuous one. Mail was slow and unreliable, carried by merchants or official couriers, and could take many months to cross the empire. A soldier might write to his family asking for warmer socks or news of a newborn child, but by the time the letter arrived, the seasons would have changed, and the child would be a toddler. The replies he received were ghosts of a life that was moving on without him. He would read of marriages, deaths, and local disputes, a world he was no longer a part of, and there was the constant fear that his letters were not arriving, or that the replies were lost. Imagine him in his dimly lit barrack room, carefully scratching words into the wax with a stylus, trying to bridge an impossible distance. He is pouring out his heart, his loneliness, his hopes. But he does not know if his words will ever be read. This was the sorrow of disconnection. He was a phantom to his own family, a name and a memory, and they were the same to him. This slow fading of connection, this gradual erosion of his place in the world he came from, was one of the most painful and persistent sorrows a legionary had to endure. The Roman army was remarkably sophisticated in its medical care for the time. Each legion had its own valetudinarium, or hospital staffed with trained physicians. They were skilled at treating battlefield wounds, extracting arrows, setting bones, and stitching cuts. But a soldier's health was under constant threat from more than just the enemy. Life in the crowded, often unsanitary conditions of a camp was a breeding ground for disease. Dysentery, typhoid, and influenza could sweep through a legion, killing more men than any battle, and for the soldier on campaign in a foreign land, there were new and unfamiliar sicknesses to contend with. An injury or an illness was a source of great fear. It meant pain, but it also meant weakness. A soldier who could not perform his duties was a burden. If he was lucky, he would recover, but a serious wound could end his career, leaving him crippled and unable to claim the retirement benefits he had worked his whole life for. A permanently injured veteran was often discharged with little to no support, left to beg or rely on the charity of his family, if he could even make it home. The sorrow of the body's betrayal was a constant anxiety. His physical strength was his only asset, and the thought of losing it, of becoming broken and useless, was a terror that rivaled the fear of a quick death in battle. For much of its history, during the Principate, Roman soldiers were legally forbidden to marry. The state believed that a family would be a distraction, that it would divide a soldier's loyalty, but human nature cannot be legislated away. Soldiers formed unofficial relationships with local women who lived in the settlements that grew up around the forts. They had children, they created families, but these unions had no legal standing. The soldier's wife was not a wife in the eyes of the law, and his children were illegitimate. He could not pass on his property or his Roman citizenship to them. This created a constant, painful emotional conflict. He loved his family. He provided for them from his meager pay, but he lived with the knowledge that if he were to die suddenly on campaign, they would have no rights and no protection. Imagine him standing at the gate of the fort, saying goodbye to his child. A child he could not legally call his own. This was a unique and cruel sorrow, to be denied the basic human right of legitimizing the family he had built. It was a love that existed in a legal shadow, a source of both profound joy and profound anxiety, a constant reminder of the control the army exerted over every aspect of his life. Faced with this constant barrage of physical hardship, psychological stress, and deep-seated sorrow, how did a soldier cope? He found solace where he could. The camaraderie with his fellow soldiers was paramount, a bond forged in shared suffering that was often stronger than blood. They would share a skin of cheap wine around the fire, gamble with dice to forget their troubles for a few hours, and tell stories of home. Religion was another vital refuge. Many soldiers were drawn to mystery cults, particularly the cult of Mithras. This Persian guard, popular with soldiers, offered a sense of brotherhood, a clear moral code, and the promise of salvation and a better life after death. In underground temples called Mithria, they would perform their secret rituals, finding a sense of purpose and control that was denied to them in their daily lives. These coping mechanisms were not cures, but they were balms for a wounded soul. They were small acts of rebellion against the dehumanizing nature of military life. They were the ways a soldier held on to his own humanity, finding moments of grace and connection in a world defined by violence and discipline. The sorrow was always there, but in these moments, it could be held at bay. If only for a little while, if a soldier was lucky enough to survive his 25 years of service. He faced one final, unexpected challenge: the return home. He was now a veteran, in his mid-40s, his body scarred, his mind filled with memories he could never share. He would return to his home village, a place he had dreamed of for decades, but he was a stranger there. The world had moved on. His parents might be gone, his childhood friends old and with families of their own. He was no longer the boy who had left, but a hardened man conditioned by a lifetime of military discipline. He found civilian life baffling, its pace too slow, its rules too lax. He might receive his plot of land, but find he had forgotten the rhythms of farming. He was trained to fight and to obey, not to haggle in the market or participate in local politics. This was the sorrow of homecoming, the painful discovery that the place you have longed for no longer has a place for you. He was an outsider, respected for his service, perhaps, but also feared. He was a man out of time, haunted by the past, and uncertain of his future. The peace he had fought for so long, felt hollow and alien. The quiet of the countryside was filled with the echoes of battle cries, and the long road of his life had led him to a home that was no longer home. And so, we are left with the image of the armor, standing empty on a wooden frame. It is still a symbol of power, of empire, of history, but now, perhaps we see it differently. We see the dents and scratches not as marks of glory, but as scars from moments of terror. We see the shape of the man it was designed to hold, a man who carried so much more than its physical weight. The Roman soldier's uniform did hide his deepest sorrows. It was designed to. It projected an image of uniformity, of unfeeling strength, because the empire needed its soldiers to be instruments, not men. But behind the helmet's visor were eyes that had seen too much. Beneath the breastplate was a heart that had been broken and mended 100 times. The story of Rome is a story of grand achievements, but it was built on the silent, unrecorded suffering of millions of men like him. Their sorrows are the invisible foundations of the ancient world. Thank you for spending this quiet time with the sleepy historian. I hope this story has given you a peaceful moment of reflection. Until next time, sleep well.